Hey everyone, welcome to Just Win with Wanda, a podcast designed to highlight people and their game winning passions. Good afternoon, Dr. Ike Ogbaa. Thank you so much for just accepting the invitation to be my first guest on Just Win with Wanda. Thank you so much again. I'm really excited to have you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be one of your first guests. And I really like the name of your podcast, by the way. Just Win Wanda has a nice ring to it. So thank you so much. I'm flattered and honored.
Thanks so much. I think I should probably get into marketing. It took a little while to find the best name, but I think this one works. And like you said, it's a bit catchy. And it kind of goes back to the purpose of the podcast, which is to help, just the younger generation really understand different career opportunities and different pathways to help them win in life, personally as well as professionally. And I know that you've had a very unique career trajectory. And before we get into the questions, I want to take some time to read some of your receipts of things that you've accomplished. So Dr. Ike Ogbaa is an executive medical director of medical affairs at the Bayer Pharmaceuticals. He is a distinguished physician and pharmaceutical executive with over 11 years of experience in pharma. You're also board certified in internal medicine. You've led numerous leadership positions at Merck as well as Sanofi. And something that I really like is that you are dedicated to the professional development of underrepresented healthcare providers. So I think you're definitely the perfect fit to be the first guest. So before we get into questions around medical affairs, just wanted to know, did you always see yourself being a physician?
Yeah, ever since I can remember as a young child. I grew up in Nigeria, and I left Nigeria when I was 14. But when I was in elementary school, I had a couple of classmates who had sickle cell disease, and they were always in and out of the hospital. And I always felt bad for them. And at that early age, I told myself I want to be a scientist so I can come up with cures for diseases. As I got older, I refined that goal to be from a scientist to be a doctor. That way I could not just come up with cures, but to also help take care of people with different diseases. Fast forward years later, I end up in pharma, and I'm doing exactly what I had dreamed I would do as a kid. I didn't exactly envision the path to be how it is right now, exactly how I landed, but I've always had a good sense of where my end goal would be, and how I got there was just circuitous, I guess I would say. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, it sounds like, the go-to quote that I've gotten from my mentors is that you just kind of have to take that next step. It's hard to map out exactly where you're going to be in 5 to 10 years because life kind of takes you in directions that you never imagined. And it sounds like that's kind of what happened with you, but you had a core purpose and core passion, which was giving back to your community and helping to solve very complex diseases, which is great. So I'm just curious, and I'm sure a lot of my followers are of Nigerian heritage or have parents that have very specific career paths that they wanted their children to undergo. Was that the same story for you? Did your parents kind of have one or two career paths that they wanted you to take?
Well, I would say yes and no.
Okay.
Yes, in the sense that they noticed that I liked sciences,
Mm-hmm.
so they kind of steered me from wanting to be a scientist to actually being a medical doctor.
Mm-hmm.
And it so happened that I loved science and math. I had no interest in the arts or literature or English, so I was okay with that. I would say when I was in college, I think my sophomore year, I almost decided to switch from being pre-med to going into business, because I've always had a business mind, also an entrepreneurial mind also. But my mom pretty much convinced me. She told me that something that was very what I feel in retrospect was really, really good advice. She said, I mean, if we were rich and we had an inheritance for you or money for you to start a business, then I would say just go ahead and get into business. But because we don't have, startup money for you, it's always nice to get your medical degree. As a doctor, you can still do a business. You can still be a business person. You can still open up a business. But if it fails, at least you have medicine to fall back on. But if you go straight into business and it fails, you're not going to have a good fallback. And that was very sage advice that allowed me to continue my path towards medicine. So I ended up going and getting that medical degree. And many, many years later, I've also started a business on the side. I do real estate investing. And so I'm really glad that I listened to my parents when it came to that advice.
That's good. Well, shout out to Mama Ogbaa for the sound advice. They always have the best things to say. And I'm sure, your passion for the business side of the industry is kind of married into your role a bit. Do you mind just sharing with the audience what it means to be a medical director for those that may not be aware?
Okay. There are many, many different things that physicians or healthcare providers can do in the pharmaceutical industry. There are physicians who develop drugs or write protocols for clinical trials to develop drugs. Those are called drug development physicians or clinical development physicians. Me, I'm a medical director for medical affairs. And what medical affairs does in the industry is to help educate physicians about new drugs that have just been approved by the FDA. And so we educate different audiences about this new, either the drug or about the disease states. And we have maybe 3 or 4 main audiences. I call them the 4 Ps. Payers, prescribers, who are like the doctors or nurse practitioners who prescribe the drugs. Policy, which is government or government decision makers, and patients. So everything what medical affairs does in the industry, we educate the different stakeholders about the new drugs. We generate new data around these drugs to help physicians make decisions as to whether to use the drug or not, and to understand the safety or the efficacy of the drug. And we also disseminate data around new drugs, whether it's through publications or presentations at medical congresses and things like that. So we're kind of the link between the drug developers and the commercial or the sales organization. And so that's what we do in a nutshell.
Nice. And from your experience, what are the qualifications that are required to become a medical director?
A medical director, you typically have to have a D degree, whether it's an MD, PharmD, or PhD. So that's one major requirement. Most medical directors are MDs, but there are pharmaceutical companies that allow PharmDs or PhDs to be medical directors. So that basic requirement is to have a D degree. And the rest is just having a good understanding and experience with how drugs are developed, understanding the rules and regulations around drug development and drug commercialization, and understanding how trials are done and how to interpret data around clinical trial results. So those are some of the requirements. But it's not easy. It's very difficult as a physician making that first transition, because they usually like people with industry experience, but it's hard to go to your first job with industry experience. So making that first leap in the industry was a really tough road, but I'm glad I was able to successfully make that transition.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I know that there are some physicians that do listen to this podcast, and they may be curious about how to make that transition. And I know you pursued like a postdoctoral opportunity. Would you be able to speak about that or other opportunities that they could consider to help them get that industry experience that would be necessary for an MD role?
Well, my first advice is to try to become a specialist in something. It's a lot easier to break into pharma as a specialist than if you're a generalist. For instance, if you're a neurologist, it's easier to be a neurology medical director, or if you're a cardiologist, to be a cardiology medical director. But when you're a generalist, like a general internal medicine physician, like I was, or a pediatrician, or a family practice, you have to do some other things to develop some type of therapeutic expertise to be able to get a specific role. And for me, what I did was I first worked with a contract research organization. So my first job was a contract job. In my first role, I worked for a phase 1 clinical trial unit that did phase 1 clinical trials for drugs in development. And those years that I was doing that happened to be around the time a lot of new diabetes drugs were being developed, a lot of new cardiovascular drugs were being developed. So diabetes and cardiovascular became my niche. And after a year and a half of doing that, I leveraged that experience to get a role in a small biotech company in Texas called Lexicon Pharmaceuticals, where I was invited to lead drug development for diabetes drug. And so that's how I got, even though I was a generalist, I was a general internal medicine. After doing a year and a half of clinical trials in diabetes, I developed expertise in diabetes and was able to leverage that experience into a medical director for diabetes role.
Okay. Yeah, and I've seen with your company, there's lots of great activity in the space of diabetes and cardiovascular. So I think it's always something that people need, new innovation and new novel therapies. So it's definitely a good niche. So in terms of individuals, because I get this question a lot, people that are interested in switching therapeutic areas, do you have any advice for individuals that may have started in one area, but they're realizing that they may have passions in other areas? What would be the best way for them to make that type of move?
For me, my biggest advice is always be flexible and always be focused on growth rather than goals, individual goals. Every career move I've made or every experience I've developed has always been to grow myself, to grow my knowledge, grow my expertise. And that naturally has led to promotions or career advancement. And so I personally am not a big fan of chasing trends. Go after what you're passionate about, or go after where you feel you can make the biggest impact or biggest meet the biggest unmet need. Mm-hmm. I chose cardiovascular and diabetes because those are the number one killers of people in the whole wide world, not just in the US. That's the most common diseases out there is cardiometabolic diseases. And so part of my desire to transition from taking care of patients, because I practiced for 4 years where I used to take care of patients every day. I switched to pharma because I wanted to be able to make an impact on a broader scale, take care of populations of patients rather than individual patients. And so I picked a disease or a therapeutic area that affects a lot of people. And so my last role was in diabetes. The company had some serious restructuring because there's so many new therapies out there for diabetes, and the diabetes market has become a little bit saturated. So I could have easily switched to oncology or rare diseases or immunology, which seem to be the most popular therapeutic areas right now. But my passion was in cardiometabolic diseases, and my passion is to take care of diseases that affect a lot of people, and especially people of color. And so I had multiple job offers. One was in immunology and one was in diabetes complications. And I chose to go with Bayer to help lead the development of a drug for diabetic kidney disease, which is a complication of diabetes. So I made a little bit of a switch from diabetes to nephrology, but I stayed in line with my passion and theme, which is cardiometabolic diseases. And I leveraged my expertise in diabetes to deal with diabetes complications, which include kidney diseases or heart diseases. So my general advice, if you're going to switch therapeutic areas, try to make sure that it's adjacent to whatever you're switching from and not completely different, because every time you switch from one therapeutic to a completely different therapeutic area, you're kind of starting all over again, and you're giving up all the relationships you've developed before, all the knowledge and expertise in the prior therapeutic area. And so it makes you less marketable. And so if you're going to switch therapeutic area, try to switch to something a little bit adjacent, a little bit similar, so that you're leveraging all the skills that you've developed over the years. For example, going from cardiology to diabetes is not a huge switch, or going from diabetes to kidney disease or diabetic kidney disease, it's not a total switch. Immunology and oncology have some synergies and similarities, but just going from one thing to something completely different where you have to start over sometimes sets your career back rather than advancing your career. So that's just my general advice for that.
Okay. Yeah. And that makes perfect sense as well. And I'm sure the higher you go up the ladder, the more difficult it may be for you to reset your trajectory by, switching to a completely new therapeutic area. But I'm curious, you did mention passion a lot as you were discussing why you decided to go with cardiovascular and metabolic diseases. Can you speak a little bit about how you differentiate passion and purpose and how people tie into that mix?
Okay. There's a cliche out there of following your passions and things like that. I've learned over the years that it's not always practical to follow your passion, because for some people, passions become great hobbies and you can't really capitalize on it. That being said, I'm a bigger fan of following your purpose, and my purpose has always been to serve people, take care of people in terms of their health and career development needs. And so whatever I'm doing, as long as I'm serving people and I'm making people feel better, that's my biggest passion. The therapeutic area is not as important. But if I can kind of stick with, what I already know and what I've been doing and what I like, I'm happy to do that, which I was lucky enough to be able to do, to go from diabetes to diabetic kidney disease. But if the only option I had was to go from diabetes to immunology, I would have been happy to do it, as long as I'm making a big impact and helping people. So I'm a big fan of always being stubborn about your vision or your goals, but being flexible on how you get there. And my overall vision was always to be either a vice president or a chief medical officer in the pharmaceutical industry. That way I can make the biggest impact possible. And so how I get there, I'm very flexible about it. And so if I need to switch companies or switch therapeutic areas in order to grow the skills and expertise to get there, I'm flexible about that. So I'm not just trying to dissuade people from being willing to switch therapeutic areas. If it's going to lead to growth and advancement, I'm all in favor of that. But the point I was trying to make is sometimes it's easier to switch to something a little bit more adjacent to what you've been doing prior. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Okay, so this is my last question for you. I know that you're big on professional development. You're a huge mentor in the pharmaceutical industry, especially among minorities. So for the individuals that are aspiring to be in medical affairs, I know right now we have tons of new fellows that have accepted opportunities. What advice do you have for these individuals that would like to be in medical affairs specifically?
My biggest advice is to focus on three things: education, exposure, and experience. Everyone knows about education, like getting whatever degree or certification you need to get into medical affairs. But the part that people don't pay enough attention is gaining exposure and gaining experience. So, for instance, if you're a PharmD and you know you want to go into pharma, it's really important during your pharmacy school to gain exposure into the industry by doing rotations, internships, volunteer experiences, finding mentors who will educate you about the industry. That's a really a good way to prepare you for getting into the industry. The other thing about experience: early in your career, you should be open-minded in terms of gaining experience and gaining exposure to different aspects of the industry. Don't just zone into one thing and thinking that's the only thing that you want to do or you're willing to do. I know a ton of pharmacy and medical students who all they want to do is become MSLs, but they don't realize there are many other options that for some people are even more exciting or more fun than being an MSL. You can do marketing, you can do HER, you can do medical strategy, you can do sales. You know, there are a lot of options. So try to expose yourself to as many different options as possible early in your career before you zone in on what you want to settle on. And so those are just my general advice about maximizing your experiences.
All right. Thank you so much, Doc. So we have now advanced to the fun portion of this podcast.
Okay.
So we're going to play a little game. It's called This or That.
Okay.
These are going to be rapid fire questions.
Mm-hmm.
You don't get several minutes to think about it. I want your quick decision.
Okay.
Are you ready?
Yes. Thank you.
The first one is American football or soccer?
American football, for sure.
Wow, that's surprising. Okay.
I'm a man of many surprises, but yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
All right, Netflix or YouTube?
That's a tough one. YouTube.
Okay. Phone call or text?
Text, for sure.
Toast or eggs?
Toast.
Superman or Batman?
Superman.
Facebook or Twitter?
Facebook, for sure.
iPhone or Android?
iPhone.
Good answer.
That was fun. I like that. That was cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you liked the game. So that's it.
Okay.
So I just wanted to again say thank you so much for, just imparting wisdom to my audience. I'm sure that they would love to connect with you outside of this medium. And if you are interested, for those that are listening, you can reach Dr. Ike Ogbaa on LinkedIn as well as Twitter at Ike Ogbaa, right?
Correct. I'm more active on LinkedIn. I barely check my Twitter, so probably better to stick with LinkedIn. And yeah. And before we end, also, I want to leave you with some gems. Thank you so much for inviting me to your first podcast. Don't go for perfection, just go for progress. Mm-hmm. And it's only going to get better with time. Your audience is going to grow with time. And I really appreciate you giving up your time to do this. We need more people like you, spreading the word, teaching people about bettering themselves. And I'm so proud of what you've achieved in your career. I remember when you're a pharmacy student or a fellow, and now you're a manager at one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world. So I'm really proud of your progress, and thank you so much for making me part of your podcast.
Thank you so much. And I think that's a good way to end it. Let's end on good gems before you share embarrassing stories. But thank you so much for your time. And I wish you and your beautiful family a happy holiday and a blissful new year.
All right. Thank you, Wanda.
Thanks. Hey everyone, if you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Now let me explain. It's free. There are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or laptop. Anchor will even distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. Also, what's really interesting is that you can even make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started today. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Just Win with Wanda. I really enjoyed speaking with Dr. Ike Ogbaa about his career as a medical director, and I really hope you enjoyed it too. So please share this episode with your friends or family members who may be interested in a career in medical affairs. If you would like to reach out to me, please follow me on Instagram at Just Win with Wanda. Catch you on the next episode. Bye.